Right, we have a question from Plarome. Should England's name eventually be changed to New Pakistan or New Punjab? Before you answer, I suppose what they're questioning is the demographic crisis that's going to happen in the country.
Yeah, well, UKIP is a democratic party, and we really believe in democracy, and especially obviously in this referendum that we so successfully brought about after fighting so hard for it for 24 years together. So yes, definitely, if and when the majority in this country want this country to be called New Punjab or New Pakistan, then there should be a vote on that. I think government should represent that view if the majority have it, and that's what should happen, yeah. Who knows what the future holds?
That is going to be the Anglophobes' dream. They're going to love hearing that. They're going to be like, UKIP's pro-abolishing England.
Well, it's not a question of that. It's about democratic representation and the majority, the legitimate rights of a majority to look at policy put forward by governments and by politicians and vote for it and have those policies actually delivered. And, we believe in that.
We always hear, don't we, that people come to Britain as migrants because they so love Britain and everything it's got to offer. So why would you want to change the name to something else? It's England, where we live, and it should stay England forever. And if people don't like living in England, there are plenty of other places in the world where they can go and live.
Well, we don't prevent them from leaving.
No, exactly.
They come here willingly, the hundreds of thousands.
Yeah,
presumably sharing our prosperity
in the millions, and I've written quite a bit about this. We have what is essentially been unlimited and uncontrolled immigration now for years, for decades, and the idea that Britain was always a country of migrants is nonsense.
Yeah,
I did read, academic research on this. Even during the Roman Empire, it was estimated that no more than about 5% of the people in Britain administering that empire were Romans. And of course people have always come. And then of course we never had, then you had, and they always talk about, migration from the Romans, from the Vikings and the Saxons. No, they weren't migration, that was conquest.
Yeah, they were
invasions. They came to conquer. Yeah. And they either drove out the existing population or they intermingled with them. And even now, actually one of the great things of the future is going to be DNA archaeology, in which they're able to understand whether people were driven out or whether they were mingled with.
Yeah.
But then from 1066 onwards, there was no great massive migration until after the Second World War. When people talk about people coming over in the medieval period or the Huguenots, yes, they did. But it was always as a very small percentage of the population. And they came over and they integrated.
Yeah. It's the same with any kind of conquest.
They didn't establish themselves as an alternative culture. And don't forget, when people talk about the Huguenots came because they were Protestants. They came because exactly in France, and they came over in order to be part of a Protestant state. So that's why it worked quite well. Sorry, I'll just finish off. What you've had from the end of the Second World War is mass immigration, very much speeded up in recent last couple of decades or so. Which is unprecedented. It has never happened before, and it is unsustainable in this country for the land mass that we have, for the resources that we have. When Tony Blair came to power, we had about 58 million people in the country. It's now estimated that there are about 66 million. By the Office for National Statistics. Yeah, but that's not counting the illegal immigrants, I'm sure. They say that the only people who really know how many people there are in the country are not the government, but people like Tesco's and Morrison's, because they're actually feeding them.
Didn't they estimate something like 80 million?
But they're not saying. Well, don't forget, I did read a figure, I'm not sure if it's up to date, that there are about 11 million visitors, tourists, holidaymakers coming in and going out. So on top of the 66, you can add 11 million at least who are coming in and going out during the course of the year. But we don't really know the real figure, and the government doesn't want to know the real figure because it will be such a scandal that they wouldn't want to answer.
I've heard that was Hackney, Diane Abbott's constituency, they don't take ethnic data anymore.
Yeah,
the constituency, which is interesting. And I'm most curious about the next census. The last one was done in 2011, and since then we've had 250,000, 300,000 net inflow of legal migration. And so come the next census, I think the numbers are going to be eye-opening, especially the demographic changes in places like Peterborough and Rochdale, and all of these areas.
One of the interesting things about this is that the average, I'm going to say, native Briton is much more closely related in terms of DNA analysis. To people, to Scottish, Northern Irish, and English, to let's say Belgians, people from northern France, Scandinavia.
North Spain.
That in fact there's a very significant gap between people of southern Europe, for instance, Spain and Italy, quite separate. So the point is that that there is the pretense that there are not distinct ethnic groups within Europe is incorrect. And as Gerard said, the issue of the rate of intermingling of the various conquests and invasions isn't known, but the numbers of people coming were very small. Interestingly, some of the remains dug up at Stonehenge show signs that the people came from all over Europe to Stonehenge 4,000 years ago, which is surprising. But the interesting point about this issue of ethnicities, we've never had a population that came to this country and grew at a much faster rate than the indigenous peoples, and so we are heading for a future of very mixed ethnicity, no question. And
but the people who get hung up on this are actually not our people on our side of the argument. The people who go on about this are actually the people who are opposed to us. Now, there isn't anything wrong in people of another ethnicity or racial background coming in, but it's the question of, do you want to be part of what you're coming into?
Yeah.
If somebody identifies as English, if they're a second-generation migrant, whatever, they say they're English, that's great, because that's what we want. It doesn't matter what colour they are or where they came from, but what we want is people who feel that they are English or British, or if they live in Wales or Scotland, they're Welsh or Scottish. What you don't want is people coming in who, after 2 or 3 generations, say they don't belong to the society that they've actually moved into.
Well, and it comes down to simple things like language. If your kids are in a school, if your children are in a class where the majority of children, don't speak the same language as them, that has very serious implications. I mean, as a parent, I had a situation with my own son where he said he wanted to learn Italian, and my wife said to him, well, it's not very widely spoken in the world, and why do you want to learn Italian? And he said, I want to be able to understand my friends. And honestly, that's what he said, aged 7 years old. And he's a bright boy, but he's spent several years now in a central London state school, and there is no question that even his class of 30 children is balkanized. The children who speak Italian at home talk to the children who speak Italian at home, and the children who speak French or Spanish and so on. And that balkanization happens in one classroom. It's also of course happening in towns and cities and villages all across this country, and it is destructive to the idea of a common heritage, a common culture, a common nationality, and something that people feel that they belong to, that builds a society that feels held together by mutual sacrifice and mutual gain.
Yeah, it's a team effort, and these people don't sound like team players. That's how I see it. And I mean, my grandfather came across from St. Helena, which is an island off the coast of North Africa, to fight the Nazis, obviously a British territory. He was a farmer, so they got him farming instead of fighting Nazis, which to be fair, I should probably be pleased about. But he was very enchanted with England. He thought England was a magical place where people played cricket, and he thought it was wonderful. And so for me, it's never been about race. It's always been about attitude and identity. And if you look at just the standard, like Wikipedia gives you an academic definition, which is purely about an ethnic group being essentially about self-identity. It's because these things are not DNA tests, but when they ask people, how do you for example, 42% of people in London don't think they're English. And it's like, well, okay, but that's concerning, isn't it? Because we are in England, and you want the majority of people in England to think of themselves as English, because English is an ethnic group. It's not a racial group. but nobody said a racial group.
You have to define it when you use, let's say, nation words now. You need to define, are you talking about an ethnic group, or are you talking about, a nation, a history, a culture, a language, and all of the identity issues? You have to actually define that.
These rules don't only apply selectively. If somebody describes themselves as Scottish, Welsh, or Irish, that's fine, that's wonderful. If somebody identifies themselves as English, that's either a bad thing or they're told they don't exist.
Well, that's so I got into a big argument with some Arabic gentlemen and some Pakistani gentlemen on an anti-Tommy Robinson page. And after getting through the vitriol and hate, I managed to actually get them to lay out what they thought. And it was interesting how one of the chaps said he believes that English is a nationality, but not an ethnicity. And, it's not like they're Arabs or something, because they come, we can track the sort of genetic movement and it's come from other places. And I just thought, well, that's very strange because, one, what difference does that make? It's an ethnicity is defined as how people feel about the continuity of this ethnicity. It's a narrative. It's a story. They tell each other, we are these things because of these reasons. We got here because of this. And, in the case of the English, we were invited over when the Romans left to fight the Picts, who are currently invading Britannia because these people couldn't fight because the Romans did the fighting for them. And, the long sort of history of the narrative of England. Secondly, how can you even assess that being English is a nationality without an ethnicity behind it? The nationality is the politicization of an ethnicity. So say the English nation is to predicate it on something that is English. If there's no ethnic group such as the English, how did you get to a nation state? Where did you get the name?
You've raised a lot of interesting questions. Don't forget that the name English comes from the Angles, who actually came from northern Germany.
Yeah.
And then if you look at, let's say, the US, or actually some other successful modern nations, like, I suppose, Australia, for instance, the nationhood certainly isn't really dependent on the indigenous ethnicity at all in those cases. I don't think so. I'm not sure. I think that's why you have to be very careful to distinguish when you use some of these words. Are you talking about a nation, a culture, a history, a language, an identity, a sense of belonging, or are you talking about a racial group or an ethnic group?
Well, that's an important distinction, and I think that Australian is also an ethnic group. It's not a racially homogenous group or anything like that. No one suggesting that. Racial, like the very fact that race is being brought into it is a red herring, in my opinion. It's really about how you feel, and that's how academics define ethnicity. It's about your beliefs, your view of the world, and your view of yourself, and your place in the world. And so an Australian is an ethnicity, and their narrative is that they were British colonists who came over, settled, and created the nation of Australia. But there's still a nation behind it. Whether it's not about race, it's just about collective understanding.
If you import hundreds of thousands and millions of people who don't share that identity,
then you've got problems.
Then you don't allow them the opportunity either to integrate, because they're going to identify with each other.
Of course.
They're not going. If you brought a family over and they live somewhere amongst the English, then the second, third generation are going to think they're English. But if you bring lots and lots and lots of people in and plonk them down, why would they identify?
Well, and with
the people who are already there, they've already got their own identity.
Absolutely, and we've done this completely the wrong way. The Americans actually had this completely right, America is a genuinely amazing place in a lot of respects, and one of them is the sort of American philosophy to become an American. You'll notice that at the beginning of the 20th century, when they started getting they had a high amount of immigration. The immigrants themselves, the German, French, Spanish, Italian immigrants, would forbid the speaking of the native tongue at home, and they would force speaking English to integrate, because there was something very positive to come into. Whereas in England, we could easily construct a very positive narrative about what England's given to the world, or Britain has given to the world, but we haven't, and we've just assumed they'll be like, oh, well, okay, we'll become like you, but there's no positive reason to do so, and we've done nothing to encourage it.
Yeah.
And so now we've got essentially colonies, and we don't know what to do about it.
Yeah, but there's also teaching. I remember outside Lord's cricket ground during the referendum, a guy of, I suppose he was Afro-Caribbean background, came up to me, and to be honest, he was quite he had some strange ideas, if I can put it that way. But one of the things that he said to me is, "My people built this country." And it was an interesting.
That's a hell of a statement.
And that was the thing, you know. It was. I mean, obviously, I didn't want to argue with him, but it was an interesting idea that he had to me. That, and to some extent, obviously, it is true, but in another sense, it really isn't. Yeah. But he was clearly fervent about it. He was absolutely convinced that was the only way to look at it. And so I felt that somehow he'd been given, you know, one part of the narrative, yes, one side of the narrative. And I assume that he was educated here in the UK, but it seems to me that he was educated in the, you know, the Marxian school of exploitation and guilt, where you know, obviously the hopeless British people couldn't possibly have ever made anything happen themselves. They had to depend on people from around the world who were obviously greatly more capable, and you know, we come across this a lot. I mean, I came across a tweet the other day from Nazir Afzal, who had been the public prosecutor who actually drew attention to some of these terrible gang crimes, gang rapes of children, and he, in his tweet, he said, you know, these are the people who've made this country better, and the names that he gave were himself and Priti Patel.
He named himself, did he?
Yes, he did, and also Sadiq Khan and Sajid Javid, and he didn't mention other kinds of immigrant. He named sort of. I'm not saying that he named Asian immigrants generally, and he didn't name anybody else. And it was a very, in a way, it was. I mean, I thought it was racist to suggest that, you know, that Britain has just made a better place by bringing in people from the part of the world that he comes from and identifies with, and that's what's made Britain better. And that's
is he saying that Diane Abbott is not making Britain better?
Yes,
because I disagree with him completely. I think the BBC would be much more dull without Diane Abbott.
And also, you know, I mean, yeah. So I think that's the point, that it was sort of ethnically very, you know, he was being choosy about who has and hasn't made this country better in a way that I thought was basically racist.